I'm 88 years old. I have spent 8.5 decades trying to make everything in my life perfect, and in pursuing perfection, I achieved something I never intended. A perfectly empty, perfectly lonely, perfectly miserable existence. I have a house where every object is in its exact place, every surface is spotless, every detail is precisely as it should be. And I have no one to share it with because I drove everyone away with my impossible standards. My name is Frederick, and I need to tell you something that took me 88 years to understand. Perfect is the enemy of happy. Perfect is the enemy of relationships, of spontaneity, of joy, of peace, of everything that makes life worth living. I spent nearly 9 decades chasing an impossible standard that exists nowhere except in my own tortured mind, and in chasing perfection, I missed every opportunity for contentment and love. You think perfectionism is a virtue. You think having high standards means you're disciplined, ambitious, successful. You think that settling for good enough means you're lazy, that accepting imperfection means you lack integrity, that compromise means you're weak. That's what I thought for 88 years. That's the lie that cost me my marriage, my relationships with my children, my ability to enjoy anything I ever accomplished, and any chance at the kind of peace that comes from accepting that life is messy and beautiful and imperfect and perfect exactly as it is. I learned perfectionism early. My mother kept a house where every surface gleamed, every item had its designated place, every meal was prepared to restaurant standards. Nothing was ever out of place. Nothing was ever almost right. Nothing was ever acceptable unless it was absolutely flawless. I watched her spend hours cleaning things that were already clean, rearranging things that were already arranged perfectly, redoing tasks that had already been completed correctly because they weren't completed perfectly. My father brought the same obsession to his work. He was an accountant who would stay late every night, checking and rechecking numbers that were already correct, reviewing and re-reviewing reports that were already accurate because accurate wasn't good enough. Perfect was the only acceptable standard. I learned that excellence wasn't sufficient, that quality wasn't adequate, that anything short of flawless was failure. The first hard truth I learned too late. Perfectionism isn't about high standards. It's about fear disguised as ambition. When you cannot accept anything less than perfect, you're not pursuing excellence. You're avoiding the anxiety of being judged, criticized, or found lacking. Perfectionism is paralysis dressed up as productivity. I carried this obsession into every area of my life. In school, I would rewrite essays multiple times, not because they needed improvement, but because they weren't perfect. I would study for tests until I knew every possible answer to every possible question, not because I enjoyed learning, but because anything less than 100% felt like failure. I graduated valedictorian, but I never experienced the joy of learning, the satisfaction of understanding, the pleasure of curiosity satisfied. When I went to work, perfectionism seemed like an asset. I was thorough, detail-oriented, someone who never made mistakes because I checked everything obsessively. But perfectionism meant that I took 3 times as long to complete tasks, missed deadlines because I was polishing work that was already excellent, drove my colleagues crazy with my insistence on redoing projects that were already successful. I would spend hours on reports that could have been completed in minutes, days, on presentations that should have taken hours. I couldn't delegate because no one could do things perfectly enough. I couldn't collaborate because other people's work always fell short. I couldn't accept feedback because suggestions meant admitting the work wasn't perfect. The second hard truth, perfectionism doesn't create better work. It creates slower work, more anxious work, work that misses its purpose because you're so focused on flawless execution that you forget what you're trying to accomplish. Perfect is often the enemy of effective, useful, and timely. I married Eleanor in 1961. She was warm, spontaneous, creative, everything I was not. For the first few years of our marriage, she tried to adapt to my need for everything to be perfect. She learned to make hospital corners on the bed sheets, to arrange flowers according to precise color coordination, to cook meals that met my exacting standards for presentation and taste. But living with a perfectionist meant that nothing Eleanor did was ever quite right. If she cleaned the house, I would find the spots she missed. If she cooked dinner, I would suggest improvements. If she decorated for holidays, I would rearrange things to achieve better symmetry. If she planned social events, I would critique the details that weren't flawless. Eleanor stopped trying to please my impossible standards and started avoiding activities that would trigger my perfectionist criticism. She stopped cooking elaborate meals because I would find fault with them. She stopped decorating the house because I would rearrange everything. She stopped planning events because I would criticize the execution. She learned to live small to avoid doing anything that might not meet my definition of perfect. The third hard truth: when you live with a perfectionist, you learn to stop trying. When nothing you do is ever good enough, you stop doing things. When your best efforts are always met with suggestions for improvement, you stop making effort. Perfectionism doesn't inspire people to do better, it teaches them to do less. We had 2 children. James was born in 1963, Susan in 1965. I loved those children desperately, but I loved them the only way I knew how, by trying to make them perfect. I had perfect expectations for their behavior, their grades, their activities, their appearance, their rooms, their friends, their interests, their futures. When James brought home a report card with 5 A's and 1 B+, I focused on the B+. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I genuinely couldn't understand why he would settle for less than perfect when he was clearly capable of achieving it. When Susan's room was 95% clean, I noticed the 5% that wasn't organized properly. When they played sports, I saw the mistakes they made rather than the skills they demonstrated. I thought I was helping them develop high standards, teaching them not to settle for mediocrity, preparing them for a world that would demand excellence. What I was actually doing was teaching them that they would never be good enough, that love was conditional on performance, that their best efforts would always fall short of their father's expectations. James stopped sharing his achievements with me because he learned that good news would be met with suggestions for how it could have been better. Susan stopped inviting me to her activities because she learned that I would focus on her mistakes rather than celebrating her efforts. Both children learned to expect criticism rather than praise, improvement suggestions rather than appreciation. The fourth hard truth: children need to feel proud of their efforts, not ashamed of their imperfections. When you focus on what's wrong instead of what's right, you teach children that they are not enough as they are. When you meet their achievements with suggestions for improvement, you steal their joy and replace it with anxiety. My perfectionism extended to our home. Every surface had to be spotless. Every object had its designated place. Every room had to look like it could be photographed for a magazine. Eleanor and the children learned to live like visitors in their own house, afraid to use rooms that might become messy, afraid to leave anything out of place, afraid to relax in a space that demanded constant maintenance of impossible standards. I would spend hours arranging and rearranging furniture to achieve perfect symmetry. I would repaint walls if they had the smallest scuff mark. I would replace perfectly functional items if they showed any sign of wear. I turned our home into a museum where life was not allowed to happen, where the mess and beauty of family life was not permitted to exist. Eleanor stopped inviting friends over because she was exhausted from maintaining my standards of house perfection. The children stopped bringing friends home because they were embarrassed by their father's obsession with having everything exactly right. We had the most beautiful house in the neighborhood and the loneliest family life, because perfection and warmth cannot coexist. The fifth hard truth: homes should be lived in, not displayed. When you care more about how things look than how people feel, you create spaces that are perfect and empty rather than imperfect and full of love. The most beautiful houses are often the least hospitable because beauty has become more important than comfort. My perfectionism made me impossible to live with. Eleanor tried for 26 years to create a marriage where good enough was acceptable, where effort mattered more than results, where love was not conditional on flawless performance. But I couldn't adapt. I couldn't lower my standards. I couldn't accept that imperfect could be beautiful, that messy could be joyful, that flawed could be lovable. In 1987, Eleanor told me that she was tired of living in a perfectly organized prison. She said she felt like she was constantly being evaluated, constantly being found lacking, constantly having to defend normal human imperfection against impossible standards. She said she wanted to live in a house where she could leave dishes in the sink overnight without criticism, where she could decorate according to her own taste without revision, where she could exist without perfection. Eleanor didn't leave me because I was a bad person. She left because perfectionism had made me impossible to love. Not because she couldn't love someone imperfect, but because I couldn't love anyone, including myself, imperfectly. I had created a life where love was conditional on performance, where acceptance required flawlessness, where relationships were evaluated like school assignments that could always use improvement. The sixth hard truth: you cannot love what you cannot accept, and you cannot accept what must be perfect. Love requires tolerance for imperfection, patience with human limitation, appreciation for effort rather than demand for results. Perfectionism kills love because love is inherently imperfect, messy, and beautifully flawed. After Eleanor left, I was alone with my perfectly organized house, my flawlessly maintained schedule, my precisely executed routines. For the first time in decades, no one was there to fall short of my standards, to disappoint my expectations, to require my constant corrections and improvements. I had achieved the perfectionist's dream, complete control over my environment with no one around to mess it up. And I was miserable. Perfectly, completely, absolutely miserable. I realized that perfectionism had given me everything I thought I wanted, and nothing that I actually needed. I had a perfect house with no laughter. I had perfect routines with no spontaneity. I had perfect order with no life, no mess, no beautiful chaos that comes from sharing space with people you love. My children called dutifully but rarely visited. They had learned to love me despite my impossible standards. But they had also learned that spending time with me meant being evaluated, corrected, and found wanting. They preferred to maintain our relationship from a distance where their imperfections couldn't trigger my perfectionist anxiety. The seventh hard truth: perfectionism is a form of emotional abuse, even when it's motivated by love. When you constantly point out how things could be better, you teach people that they are not acceptable as they are. When you cannot appreciate what is because you're focused on what could be, you make people feel invisible and unvalued. At 79 years old, I started to notice something that had been invisible to me for nearly 8 decades: the difference between perfect and good enough, between flawless and excellent, between ideal and satisfactory. I started to see that most of the things I had rejected as inadequate were actually perfectly fine, that most of the improvements I had demanded were unnecessary, that most of my standards were arbitrary and self-imposed rather than objectively important. I began to experiment with accepting good enough. Instead of spending 2 hours cleaning my kitchen until it sparkled, I spent 30 minutes cleaning it until it was sanitary and functional. Instead of arranging my bookshelf by height, color, and subject, I arranged it in a way that was easy to find what I needed. Instead of maintaining a schedule that was precise to the minute, I created routines that were flexible enough to accommodate unexpected pleasures. The change was gradual and difficult. My brain had been trained for 8 decades to spot imperfections, to identify areas for improvement, to never rest until everything was flawless. Learning to accept good enough felt like learning to breathe underwater, like trying to speak a foreign language, like wearing clothes that didn't fit properly. But slowly, I started to experience something I had never felt before: satisfaction. Not the temporary relief of achieving temporary perfection, but the deep contentment that comes from accepting that imperfect can be beautiful, that good enough can be wonderful, that done is better than perfect. The eighth hard truth: good enough is often better than perfect because good enough leaves room for life, for spontaneity, for joy, for other people's contributions, for the beautiful mess that makes existence meaningful. Perfect is often the enemy of everything that makes life worth living. I see my neighbor across the street, a woman about my age who tends a garden that is anything but perfect. Her flowers grow in seemingly random patterns. Her vegetables are planted without precise spacing. Her yard has weeds mixed in with the intended plants. But when I watch her work in that imperfect garden, she radiates joy. She hums while she plants, laughs when things don't grow as expected, shares produce with neighbors even though the tomatoes aren't uniform in size. Her garden is imperfect and beautiful. Her house is lived in and welcoming. Her life is messy and full of people who love her exactly as she is, imperfections and all. She has achieved something that my perfectionism never allowed: the ability to find beauty in imperfection, to accept good enough as actually good, to prioritize happiness over flawlessness. I realize now that perfectionism was never about creating beauty or achieving excellence. It was about control, about anxiety, about the fear that if everything wasn't perfect, something terrible would happen. It was about the belief that I could prevent criticism, disappointment, or rejection by simply never giving anyone anything to criticize, disappoint, or reject. But perfectionism doesn't prevent criticism, it invites it. When you present yourself as someone who accepts nothing less than flawless, you challenge other people to find your flaws. When you cannot tolerate imperfection in others, you train them to look for imperfection in you. When you make perfect your standard, you make yourself a target for everyone who wants to prove that perfect is impossible. The ninth hard truth: perfectionism doesn't protect you from criticism, it guarantees it. When you cannot accept imperfection, you give other people power over you by making their approval necessary for your self-worth. When you need everything to be perfect, you become a slave to standards that are impossible to maintain and pointless to pursue. I'm 88 years old now. I have maybe 5 more years, maybe less, and I am spending these final years learning to live with imperfection, to find beauty in good enough, to appreciate effort rather than demanding results. I leave dishes in the sink overnight sometimes. I wear clothes with wrinkles. I have dust on surfaces that don't affect my health or happiness, and for the first time in my life I feel free. Free from the exhausting tyranny of impossible standards. Free from the constant anxiety of not meeting my own expectations. Free from the need to control every detail of every experience. Free to appreciate what is rather than constantly focusing on what could be better. But I also think about all the joy I missed while pursuing perfection, all the relationships I damaged with my impossible standards, all the experiences I rejected because they weren't flawless, all the years I spent polishing life instead of living it. Don't make my mistake. Don't spend your life chasing perfect and missing beautiful. Don't sacrifice good relationships for impossible standards. Don't choose flawless over joyful, perfect over satisfying, ideal over real. Learn to love good enough, embrace beautiful imperfection, choose done over perfect, progress over perfection, connection over correction. Life is messy and wonderful, imperfect and beautiful, flawed and completely sufficient just as it is. The people who love you don't need you to be perfect. They need you to be present, accepting, and capable of finding joy in the gloriously imperfect reality of human existence. I'm tired now. Tired of remembering all the perfection I pursued while missing all the beauty that surrounded me. Perfect was never the goal. Happy was always the goal. It just took me 88 years to learn the difference.